Hey guys, I'm back with round two from the Bay Area International that just took place earlier this year. And in round two, I was paired against a really strong player, Grandmaster Darius Swerts, who's like well over 2,600, former World Junior Champion. So, I mean, huge challenge to go up against such a player. Okay, in any case, he played e4. I went with my usual Sicilian, knight f3, e6. And I was kind of surprised he went for this line. I played the Taimanov Sicilian here with queen c7. And then he went for the super sharp and trendy bishop e3 and queen f3. I mean, this is kind of just like taken over as the very main line against the Taimanov and the main way white is trying to fight for an advantage these days. Now, preparing for the game, I was more expecting him to play with d4 or c4 because this is also part of his repertoire. I didn't think against a weaker player he'd go for such a sharp line, but it seems like he was fairly well prepared here and he really knew what he was doing. So yeah, this was definitely a tough game. Okay, I thought for a little while here because black has a couple of options. In the past I've played with knight e5 and b5 as well as the move bishop d6 followed by bishop e5, which is also kind of solid for black. In this game I decided to play d6 mainly to kind of switch it up, hoping he prepared for some of the other lines more and didn't focus on this line as much. He thought for a little while, eventually played knight takes c6, which I think is a pretty interesting try for an advantage. Now black has a choice to take with the queen or the pawn. I've always felt like taking with the pawn should be better here because you get the open b file, and now actually black has ideas of playing e5 in this kind of position with the benefit that the pawn on c6 is covering the d5 square, so this is now more doable than before. Now white, I mean, has different ways of playing the position. He decided to castle queenside, which I think is very principled. I play knight f6. Queen went to g3 as it typically does in this line, eyeing both the d6 pawn and the g7 pawn. And I played natural move rook to b8. I've done some opening work on this game later on. I think bishop e7 is also somewhat playable. But if you want to check out the details, the game is fully annotated and will be posted up on my Patreon page. And I'll have a link for that down in this video below. Also, make sure to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. I always forget to remind people to do that. Any case, I played rook b8, and I think, okay, it's a natural move. I'm just targeting b2, and now white always has to worry about potential tactics here. He played bishop e2, and here I took a think. I had some choices here. I could, again, just play the natural move bishop to e7. I didn't mention this before, but the pawn on g7, usually white doesn't want to take this one because black can play rook g8, and I'm not sure if I really want to take back on g2 or just play like rook g6, and white's queen is kind of running out of good squares because queen h3 is going to run into e5, and black is just getting a lot of tempos. The bishop can come to e6, queen will eventually come to a5, and I think black will probably just get excellent counterplay for the pawn. But I decided to throw in h5 before going for bishop e7. This is a pretty thematic move for black in this kind of position. The idea is just to play h4 and kick white away from the g3 square, where the queen is pretty well placed. He decides to play h4, which I think is quite a good move, just stopping black from advancing further. Now I played bishop e7, and here he went for a very surprising move. Now again, if white takes on g7, I think this is even worse than before, because here the queen is just really running short on squares, like has to go back to f4, then I can play e5, and the queen has to go to like h2, which is quite awkward for him. f4 is definitely possible. It's a pretty aggressive move. Then I think there was one game here where black played g6, just, well, defending the pawn, then after e5, put the knight on d5, and this seems kind of playable for black. The whole line is very, very complicated, so I can't pretend like I really understand much about these positions. They're very sharp, and there are a lot of very concrete tactics, so both sides kind of have their ideas, but it really comes down to who can really calculate better in this kind of position. Okay, so here Swartz played bishop c5. which definitely took me by surprise. I knew this move was possible, but I didn't think it was all that strong. But he's now hitting the d6 pawn. I, of course, can't take the bishop because my queen is hanging. And if I play the most natural move, e5, the problem is white has this tactic, bishop takes d6. And we see the problem in black's position, the problem of keeping the king in the center, like everything ends up hanging. So white takes 2 pawns, the rook is hanging, knight on f6 is hanging. I can play like rook g8, queen takes f6, but I didn't think black would really have enough compensation here for the 2 pawns. Like bishop e7, he can just get out with his queen, and yeah, eventually white will just, I think, slowly consolidate, maybe even putting the bishop on b3, and black just won't get anything on the b file. So with that out of the question, I started looking for other moves. I quickly noticed that queen b7 was possible, and this seemed like kind of my only good move in the position. Then I figured white would likely put the bishop on a3. This seems like kind of his idea, defending the b2 pawn and keeping pressure on d6. But then in that position, I realized that black would have this move d5. Which looks very tempting and interesting because I'm hitting the bishop on a3, and we'll see in that position if white plays bishop takes e7, I'm going to have queen takes b2 check and more tactics after that. So I calculated more because there was a lot of lines to look at here, but I'll just take you guys through some of the critical moments. So yeah, d5. I mean, it's really actually the only move for black to even stay into the game. If I play something like e5, which I also wanted to do, white can even make a simple move like b3, and black has no counterplay and nothing to show for these weak pawns on d6 and g7. And now white is even threatening to just take on d6. And I think black's position is quite bad, quite tenuous. So d5. And now the main point of black's play is that if white takes on e7, taking back with the king is not great because that gives white a chance to play like b3 and just defend the b2 pawn, but I can take on b2 with check, king d2, and then I even take on c3 with check, which is a really nice tactic. So it took me a while to calculate these lines because a lot of pieces are coming off the board. I think the principal line is that after queen takes e3 or king takes e3, knight takes e4, it comes with check. King has to move somewhere. I assume king d3 seems like the most natural response here, just because after knight takes c3, at least white is keeping an eye on this knight. But the bishop on e7 is also hanging, and black has picked up 2 pawns in the process. So if white just takes on c3, king takes c7, black is like 2 pawns up and completely winning. Instead, if white plays a move like bishop d6, counterattacking the rook and keeping the attack on the knight, black is just taking more material here with knight takes d1, bishop takes b8, knight takes f2, and then I'm picking up the other rook in the corner. So these tactics seem to be working out for black, but the move that really, I had to spend a lot of time on is this move bishop takes a6, which I felt like was likely my opponent's idea. So I saw this coming ahead of time. I had to, calculate everything out in advance. It took a while, but I feel like I did a pretty reasonable job here. Okay, so white's point is if queen takes a6, then he is not going to grab the rook yet because I can take on a3, but probably just take on e7 first. Now I have nothing better than king takes e7, queen takes b8, and then black is just kind of down in exchange for nothing here. I don't think black is just getting any play whatsoever. So after bishop takes a6, originally I just wanted to discard the whole line. Then I realized that after queen b6, I'm keeping all my threats in the position. This is still kind of working for black. So bishop takes a3 is still a threat. I'm obviously threatening to take the bishop now with bishop takes a6. And so white also has to just be extremely precise here. If he takes on e7 now, this doesn't really change anything, so black can go for this line and is taking a lot more material here. So he plays knight a4. Again, I think the best move and definitely putting black under a lot of pressure. Now my queen is hit. I'm basically forced to play queen takes a6. But this is a little bit different compared to before because, actually I should say a lot different because the knight on a4 is under attack here. So if white now takes on e7 and takes on b8 as before, black just plays queen takes a4, has 2 pieces for the rook, and is probably just having a big advantage here as the queen is active and white's rooks are not in the game yet. Instead, after knight a4, queen takes a6, Darius just takes on b8 right away. Now I can't take on a4 yet because queen c8 is hanging, so I took on a3, b takes a3, And this is where I make a really critical mistake. So I definitely considered queen takes a4 here, but eventually I decided against it because I just felt like black had a better option. I think this was the right call because queen takes c8, king e7. Actually, I didn't check the line yet with the computer, so I don't know if this is really working for black. I thought I had at least a perpetual here, or perhaps some play coming with knight takes e4, but I couldn't quite make it work. In any case, I don't think white has to take the rook anyway. He can also give like queen b7 check, king has to go back, and then find some nice move here, because now I can no longer castle, and I think white can just try to stay up in the exchange here. Maybe even queen b3 can be played. The move I ended up deciding on is just this simple move, castles. The point being that now the knight on a4 is hanging, the knight can't move because I'm going to take the a3 pawn with check, and I also have knight takes e4 in the position. What I should have done instead was actually just take on e4 right away, and there's a very critical difference here. So the point is that in the game after I castled, white played very accurate move queen b4, I took on e4, and then another really nice move, knight to c5. Now my queen is attacked, my knight is attacked, and white is essentially forcing a trade of knights, which is just going to leave him with a position where he's up a clear exchange. Rook for bishop, black won't even have an extra pawn for it. And without the knights on the board, it doesn't feel like black is really going to be able to take advantage of white's weakened position on the queen side. With knights on the board, I can always kind of play against these double pawns and hit the f2 pawn. With these guys traded off, yeah, I'm just left with this bishop that's kind of hard to get into the game and make it really effective. So this is why I really should have played knight takes e4 first. Here, white just doesn't have this idea with queen b4 and knight to c5. Because f2 pawn is hanging, so he has to do something. I think the best move is probably rook e1, where if I take on f2, he can put his second rook on d4, and then this is starting to look kind of worse for black and very, very shaky. Instead, after rook e1, probably the best move would be to castle now. So I'm wanting to take on f2, and I'm still threatening to take the knight on a4, of course. So I think the engine was saying that rook takes e4 is just the only move for white. Not just to play for an advantage, but to keep from falling worse. Then after d takes e4, queen b4, I think black has a lot of options here. The one I really like is just the simple move e5. And I'm ready to just give back the e4 pawn whenever. I really don't care about this pawn. I just want to get my bishop out somewhere active and eventually bring the rook to an open file, and we'll start putting pressure against white's king. So after something like knight c5 and knight takes e4, bishop f5, rook b8 is coming. I feel like black would have pretty reasonable play here, but okay, the position is still super complicated. Well, after not finding knight takes e4 and just playing castles, which is just very, very inaccurate, queen b4 happened and white was able to force a trade of knights. I played e5 here just to get the bishop out, rook e1, and then f6. And here white found a really strong plan to start consolidating his advantage. And he played the move rook to d3. Point being, after bishop f5, he puts the rook on b3. And with this rook on b3, black can never activate his own rook. I would love to play the move rook to b8, but now that's just impossible. And because this move is not possible, rook a8 is also kind of ineffective. Black just doesn't get enough here, and white is just slowly improving his position and eventually breaking through. So he really played a nice game here. I think it was basically flawless. Like at this point, he has a big advantage, and he was able to convert it really without giving me any chances whatsoever. I tried queen a4 just to hit the h4 pawn, maybe get queen f4 check. White plays g3, of course, covering everything. Here I made a mistake with d4. I think this kind of makes things even worse for black, but I couldn't really find a useful move here. Maybe a move like rook a8 was better, trying to play, I don't know, rook a5 or something just to destabilize white's queen, but white still has a really big advantage there after like king b2, and again, everything is just kind of protected. Okay, so I played d4, and this allows white to play f4, which is just a very strong move. I can't take because my bishop is hanging, but otherwise white is ready to just take on e5 and completely open things up for a second rook on e1. You might think that like opening the position would be in black's favor because white's king is kind of weak and maybe I can get my pieces going, but White simply had everything under control, and I was never able to accomplish much here. So I tried bishop g6. He takes on e5, then takes with the rook. Queen takes e5 would run into rook e8, so I'm sure, he is never going to blunder that. So rook e5, I tried queen a6, hoping to get some checks in, maybe queen f1, but White's king just goes to b2 and ends up super safe. In fact, he did this right away. I tried d3 just to open some more lines. He takes, and then he goes for the 7th rank with rook e7. This was just a very straightforward and good winning plan. F2 square is covered, so I can't get this nice rook f2 check in, and the second rook is coming to b7, and basically it's game over. So bishop g6 was played, rook b7. I tried king h8. Now White can blunder with rook takes g7, which would allow queen e2 check, and then, well, Black just has queen and rook against an open king, so Black might even be winning here with rook f3 check coming, or at least some kind of perpetual check, perhaps. Instead, of course, White just keeps everything under control, queen d4. Now f2 and e2 are both still covered, so Black just has 0 good checks here. I had to defend the pawn with rook to g8. Again, hoping for rook takes g7 so I can get queen e2 check in, but White plays a much better move, a4. Definitely a very classy move. He's just creating another square on a3 for the king. Then after c5, queen to c3, Black is basically just not getting any checks, and now White is finally ready to take on g7, because if I play queen e2 check in that position, the king goes to a3, and Black simply has no checks. So I thought for a little while here, I was in heavy time trouble at this point, because my position is basically terrible, and I decided to resign just because I'm basically out of ideas. The only move I could really try is maybe after queen c3, queen f1, but White can safely take on g7 here, queen b1 check, king a3. I have this funny move, queen b4 check, but it simply doesn't cut it. White can take, king takes, I take on g7, and White pushes a5 and just has a completely winning endgame here. Okay, so quite a tough game, but it was a really interesting game, and I think White played very well, so I'm sure it's quite instructive for you guys to see how White was able to convert the advantage there. This is definitely one where I really have to check the opening carefully, especially after bishop e7, bishop c5. These lines are super sharp. According to the engine, Black was kind of doing okay had I found this this move knight takes e4 back in this moment instead of castling, but it still would have been a super complicated game, so no guarantees I wouldn't have lost this game anyway. But my mistake kind of made things easy for White. He's able to just trade off the knights, and this position was not really offering Black much counterplay in the long run. Okay, this was round 2. I won my first game, so at this point I was on 1 out of 2. Then my next couple of games were pretty tough, so I don't look forward to showing those, but of course that is the way to get better and learn from your mistakes. So stay tuned for seeing some of my worst games of this year. Take care.